This video is sponsored by Squarespace.
In my last video, I experimented with dyed wood veneers and patterned plywood to add a little bit more color and contrast. And at the end of that video, I asked you guys what was your favorite pattern and what would you like me to make out of it. Your favorite pattern by far was this one, which is what you guys started calling the dragon scale patterned plywood. So that's what I'm using this week. And the most requested thing that I could find was a turned wood bowl out of it, which at first I was like, I don't have a lathe in my shop, but I fell in love with the idea of this pattern wrapping all the way around a bowl. So I did some more research. I discovered something called a stave bowl. I also found some guides on how to make a stave bowl, which I'm gonna share with you. And basically they're built by using flat panels, which is something that I can do in my shop. So that's what I'm doing this week. I'm making a 12-sided dragon scale patterned plywood stave bowl because you asked for it. All right.
Now, if you're like me, looking at this is pretty intimidating. It looks like homework, but it's really just a spreadsheet. I'm gonna link to all these down below and talk about them in more detail later. But basically what I'm doing here is taking my old panel and tracing out the angle that I want, figuring out what sort of pitch of the bowl I'm looking for that'll cut well through the pattern. I wanna make sure that those holes in the pattern aren't right along a cut. And I also need to calculate how many tiles are in each individual pattern so that I know how much pattern plywood to make.
40 pieces per panel. I need 5 panels. So that equals 520 pieces, 12-inch stick. One of these produces 20 half-inch pieces. So 520 divided by 20 is 26. And then I need to figure out how many of these veneers I need to cover enough to produce 26 of these. Yeah, that's it.
In my last video, I went into quite a bit of detail how to apply veneers for patterned plywood to add more contrast to the design. I'm not gonna go into quite as much detail in this video on that, but I have learned a couple things since then, and I also got a lot of questions, so I'm gonna do my best to answer those. One of the number one questions that I get about patterned plywood is what kind of plywood I use, and this is Baltic birch plywood. I really prefer it, but that's not to say that any plywood doesn't work. You can use whatever plywood you like. I just like the consistency of the veneers and the fact that all the veneers are the same type of wood. I think it looks better in the end, but that's of course a personal opinion. I also got some really great recommendations in the comment section of the last video suggesting what I could do to prevent the cracking I was getting on the edges of the veneers. It seems like the consensus is that my iron was just too hot and that was causing the cracks. That seemed to solve it. I just lowered it by a couple of notches and it was fine, but you can see that there's a couple of gaps in between the veneers. And after thinking about it for a while, I think that's when I heat it up, the veneer shrinks a bit. And even though I aligned it directly on the edge, it shrunk. But I'll show you in a little bit how I corrected for that.
I messed up. I messed up really bad. So these are supposed to be cut at 45 degrees, not 60 degrees. So they're all wrong. And I can use them for other pattern plywood, but not the pattern that I have planned. And the other pattern's not gonna line up for a bowl. So fortunately, I've got a little bit of leftover, but I'm completely out of black veneer. I used all of it up for this. So all of these are useless, and I'm gonna have to go out and buy more, re-glue it up. I'm kind of out a whole day's work. It is what it is. I'm gonna just go and do it again.
after all that drama, I might have bought myself a drum sander to make me feel a little better. I'm not ashamed of it. This thing's awesome. I was also able to get myself plenty of black veneer, and as you can see here, I sort of solved that shrinkage issue. All I did was overlay one piece of veneer over the top of it, just slightly, so when it shrunk down, it was still overlaid, and then I could sand that down, and you couldn't see the seam at all. So now I'm setting the angle properly, which is 45 degrees. I was confused. The 60 degrees is for the hex pattern. In the last video, I made both the hex pattern and the mitered pattern, the alpine pattern. So I just had 60 degrees in my head, which was the last angle that I had cut before. But no, 45 is the correct angle. I also figured out that all the pieces that I cut before were not useless. They were actually totally usable. I just could only get one side out of them. So I switched the fence over a little bit, and I was able to cut so that I got one complete side out of that batch. With that glue up done, I could finally go and open up my drum sander. I'm so excited to have this in the shop. I've been thinking about it for a long time. I talked to my buddy Blake Weber at the Weber Wood Shop. He recommended this unit. I've been wanting to add a drum sander to the shop because it just is going to make sanding up pattern plywood so much easier. And honestly, I can't see myself stopping making pattern plywood anytime soon, so I might as well invest in the right tool for the job. That's not gonna happen. When I was doing the mitered glue up, I saved a couple of the mitered pieces and didn't glue them up. I'm going to be using these to fill in the blanks so that I can get flat sides on all of my panels. Since consistency is really important on these stave bowls, I decided to kind of up my game when it came to clamping. Previously, I'd just been using clamps to clamp these up, but I've had the idea for a while to use wedges instead. Wedges are going to distribute the pressure more evenly, and they're also potentially can add a lot more clamping pressure. That's the hope, at least. So what I've done is I've made a couple of bays and a couple of wedges that fit into those bays. I also have what I'm going to call cawls that will support them when they get wedged down. Everything's covered in wax, everything's covered in packing tape, and then it's melamine on the bottom, so nothing's going to stick to it. The wedges seem to be working exactly as I'd hoped. One thing that I didn't account for is that I needed some sort of bumper to keep the wedge kind of in place while the other wedge wedges in. The other thing that was cool about this is that I have complete access to the panel. I can see what's raised up. If this is covered in clamps, I can't see it, but in this case, I could just hammer down anything that I lifted up. So the stave bowl that I've planned is a 12-sided stave bowl, which means I need at least 12 panels. And so I made 2 bays on my first mold and quickly realized that I needed a second mold. So I made a second one. The nice thing about this is that as one was drying, the other one can be glued up. Although, honestly, it only takes about 20 minutes per panel to glue them up and get them wedged. So I want them to sit for at least 4 hours before I pop them out of the clamps. When they're against that melamine, they don't dry very fast. So in the meantime, I just hung out with the dog. You spin? Spin. Good boy. Spin. Winston. Spin. Yeah. Good boy. Sit. Down. Good boy. Good boy. This video is sponsored by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and help run your business. I've been using Squarespace ever since I started AlmFab, and I've been extremely happy with it. Squarespace makes it super simple to open an online store. You can sell products, services, subscriptions, and digital content. I currently use my store on almfab.com to sell digital plans for my jigs, shop cabinets, and furniture. It's also easy to set up galleries, which is great when you're trying to show off your work to potential new clients. All images hosted on Squarespace can be edited directly within your browser using Squarespace's built-in image editor. You can crop, resize, rotate, adjust brightness and contrast, and much more. So I actually have a second Squarespace website, michaelalm.com, which is basically just a series of galleries that are designed to showcase my sculpture. I've literally gotten art gallery shows from this website, and it only took a couple hours to set up. So check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, visit squarespace.com/michaelalm for 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. Thanks, Squarespace. Now back to the build. It took me a little while to figure out how to pop the wedges out. I tried just hammering it. I tried slamming a screwdriver into them and getting them to pop, which worked, but the best way was to pry them out, which I figured out eventually. These panels came out super nice. Like, these are the best panels I've ever glued up of patterned plywood. I'm hands down using this method for all the rest of my glue ups moving forward because it just worked so well. They're super flat. The joints don't have any gaps in them. And honestly, this is a way better method than the one that I was using before. When it was all said and done, all those parts and pieces yielded 14 panels, which was perfect. All I needed was 12, and it's always good to have 1 or 2 extra. It was at this point that I was ready to use the drum sander, but the drum sander wasn't ready to be used. So I ran out to the shop and grabbed some casters so that I could roll it around. And then I also called in my neighbor Corbin to see if he'd help me lift the machine into place. All right, so I have not lifted this yet, obviously, so we'll just see. I don't think it's crazy heavy.
It seems all right so far.
Got it? Okay, 1, 2, 3. This is huge.
Going down like this?
Yeah. There, if we scratch the base, that's not gonna bother me at all. Okay, let's lift it up and twist it. That should be there. Let me put a couple bolts in it.
You want me to square up my side here?
Sure. Thank you, Corbin, for the help. That was so nice to have an extra set of hands. I was coming up with all sorts of rope and pulley systems in my head to get it lifted into place, but it was way easier just to have another person in the shop. It took me a bit to get the machine tuned up. I went through the instruction manual, which I don't usually do, but this thing, I wanted to get it tuned up correctly, and I've been told by several people taking the time to tune it up early is important. But once it was tuned up, it was just so nice. So nice. The amount of time that I've spent with a palm sander sanding patterned plywood, which is basically end grain wood, I don't want to have to do that anymore. So this is a great time saver, certainly a pricey time saver, but for me, considering how much of this stuff I sand up, it's amazing. And just the fact that it's all dimensionally the same is going to help a lot when it comes to assembling this bowl. The surface finish coming off the sander was great. I should also mention that I'm not sponsored by this sanding company. I'm just honestly impressed with the tool. It was really saved me a ton of time. I touched it up a little bit with a palm sander and then decided to square up the bottom edges of each panel. I'm going to be building a jig for the individual staves, and it needs to be super accurate, so I wanted to make sure that all these panels were square on the bottom. Sometimes in the glue up, the parts can drift a little bit. I also cut out a bunch of pieces of MDF exactly the same size so that I could use those as kind of a dummy test bowl before I commit to cutting these pieces of patterned plywood that I just spent days working on. So fair warning, there is a little bit of math involved in making a stave bowl, but it's made a lot easier because I found a couple of charts online. One of them is by the great Matthias Wandel, who is an amazing YouTuber. If you haven't seen his stuff, I'm honestly shocked if you're watching mine and haven't seen his. The other one is from Malcolm Tibbet. I found this through another YouTuber's video, which I will link down below, and this one is handy as well. They just have different angles, but the math is essentially all the same. Because the sides of the stave bowl are tipped, their compound angles and both the miter and the blade angle change as you get a wider and wider bowl, which is all to say that you just have to look up the angle on these charts, and when you find them, you figure out where to set your blade. One thing that you're gonna find is that some of the angles, the Malcolm Tibbet chart is set to the complementary angle of what Matthias Wandel chart is. So Matthias's chart says 12.38 degrees, whereas Malcolm Tibbet's is gonna say 77.84 degrees. That's all to say that they're the same number, they're just coming from a different direction. If you use the Matthias chart like I did, you're just going to have to subtract that angle from 90, and I ended up with 81.46 degrees, which is what I set my table saw blade to. All right, now that all the technical jargon is out of the way, let's get into building this jig. I just ran a sheet of 3/4 inch plywood through the table saw, cutting off that edge at that 81.4 degree angle. And then I can set up for the angle of the miter cut. And for this, I'm using a digital protractor. I just bought this on Amazon. I'll post a link down below. I think it was 15 or 20 bucks. And I was concerned about the accuracy of it. So this is going to be its test to see how accurate it really is. The little digital readout got in the way of flipping the protractor over to the other side. So I just grabbed a bevel gauge. That worked great. I set that at the same angle, and then I can mark out my lines. It was at this point that I realized that I can't cut the miter with it all the way out to the edge, because with that beveled angle it would actually exceed the width of the panel. So in order to figure that out, I just laid a straight edge on there and sort of scribed a line underneath the panel, figured out how far I needed to inset it so that I wouldn't exceed the width of the panel, and that ended up being just about 1/8 of an inch. The next step is to build a fence around this panel. And for that, I'm just going to be using a couple of scrap pieces of plywood and setting them up 90 degrees at that angle that I just established. And I can actually use that bevel gauge set up at the exact same angle to double check everything. So I'm not completely reliant on that pencil line underneath the panel. To make the jig a little bit more safe and reliable, I added in an armor tool hold down. These are auto adjusting, which is super nice. I don't have to dial it in at all. I just basically screw it on and it'll hold down whatever thickness material I put in there. After a test cut in the MDF, I double checked the angle just to make sure that it was right, which it was still exactly where it was supposed to be, which is good. And then I transferred my lines to the other side. I could then flip it over on the jig, clamp it down, and build another set of fences. The cool thing that I discovered on the second set of fences is that I could use the offcut from the MDF panel, and since it already had that beveled edge on it, it registered perfectly. The test piece looked good, but I needed to make a bunch of them in order to see if they're actually going to make a bowl. So I decided to just cut 6 of them so I'd have about half a bowl, and then I could check from there so I didn't just use up all of my MDF test pieces on this one go. Hey, I think that's gonna work. Yeah. Ah! I think it's gonna work. Let's cut 6 more. What? I think this might work. Okay, once. I didn't expect that to work so well. What? The angles, they look good. Don't want to jinx myself, but if the real one's like this, that is so awesome. So I really wanted the upper points to stay intact, but that upper corner, it just was not supported well enough by the jig. There wasn't enough glue service, and it just kept breaking. The first two I cut broke, and then I started using a pencil, and that worked for most of them. But like I said, I only had 14 panels, and at least 6 of them broke loose. Ultimately, I had to make a decision, and I really wanted to keep that pointy edge, but these top ones, they just weren't, they weren't going to hold. So I ended up actually cutting all of the remaining ones off, and then the areas that had missing pieces of veneer, I actually had extra veneer with the glue on the back side of it. So all I had to do was iron them on, fill in the missing spaces, and then cut off the excess. After that, I was ready to glue it up, and as far as I could figure, the best way to clamp this is just with a whole bunch of tape. I might have just gotten lucky on this one. I honestly am shocked that this glued up as well as it did and as smoothly as it did. Also, I added tape to the inside, which I think was a really good idea because it just saved me a lot of extra cleanup time. I basically have these finished sanded, so I didn't want to put a lot of sanding into them. So I just peeled the tape off when the glue was still a little wet, and then came back with a chisel and trimmed off all the excess. Now here's something that I didn't really plan for, how to do the bottom. I have seen other people do like run a rabbiting bit around the inside and then rabbet the panel in, which would work, except for Patterned Plywood in the past has exploded on me when I've run router bits on it. So I just decided to try and make a tapered bottom. I didn't know if this was going to be possible or if I could get the angles right, but assuming that the glue up was good, then all the angles should be the same. I took a scrap piece of 1/2-inch plywood, the same plywood that the rest of the bowl is made out of, and I beveled all of the edges. Then I used my Rockler precision miter gauge. This took me a minute because the angle is both 30 degrees and 60 degrees. Both would work. 30 felt a little bit safer, so I adjusted it a bit. The nice thing about this miter gauge is that it has a positive stop at 30 degrees, so it cut this at the perfect angle. I was hoping to be able to use the stop and just place that and cut all the parts exactly the same, but I realized that by the time I got to the fourth side, it was gone. So I just ended up eyeballing it and going up to the lines that I had drawn. So the first test was good, not great. It was sitting up too high, which means that I started with too small of a panel, and then it was also sitting kind of weird. It was tight on 4 of the sides. I double checked this by rotating the bowl, so I just wanted to check to make sure that the bowl wasn't different on all the angles, that what I was messing up was the angles on the panel, which was the case. And so I knew what I had to do was cut a larger one and try and get more precise with the angles. After a quick search on what you call a 12-sided shape, which is a dodecagon, and how to draw one, I found out exactly how to draw one. I'll post the link to the video down below. It's not that hard, and I was able to get a really accurate drawing so that I could take it over to the precision miter gauge and cut it out. So those cuts got me in the ballpark. I was way closer than the first go, and there were just a couple spots that needed trimming. So I marked those out, took them back over to the miter sled, and one more go, and that's all it took to get a nice tight fit. In order to blend the base with the rest of the bowl, I'm going to be using India ink to dye it black. I covered this in my finishes video. I use India ink on a bunch of things, a bunch of furniture projects and frames. It's a great stain. It's not a finish, so you will need a top coat, but with about 3 or 4 coats, you'll get a super dark black finish that will last a really long time. That I could just remove all the tape and give it a final sand and polish. This bowl is just I'm just so shocked by it, to be honest. I'm super excited to try more of these bowls. There's definitely a lot of work that goes into them, but I made this inside of a week, and learned a whole lot. I think next time I'd be a little more confident going in. I also love that people are calling this stuff dragon scale, even though it's the alpine pattern with that kind of reversal. For some reason it looks like sort of dragon hide or something medieval. If you want to see more bowls like this, or you want to see me experiment more with patterned plywood, leave a comment, because I literally built this because of comments that people left, and I love the idea of collaborating on these pieces. And there's so much left to explore with patterned plywood. I say it every time, I've barely scratched the surface, but I mean it. And a lot of ideas come from people who are on Instagram. I want to give a shout out to Duncan Hooper, who helped me through this entire process. His Instagram handle is Firewood Creations, and we talked back and forth on how to make stave bowls. He makes these, and he's also done patterned plywood ones as well, and he's an incredible maker. Thank you, Duncan, for all your help on this project. Now it's time for me to stop talking and show you the finished patterned plywood dragon scale stave bowl. So for those of you who stuck around to the end of the video, I got a surprise. Check this out. This is a second bowl made entirely out of the scraps from the first bowl. All of the offcuts are just glued together. They already have the correct angle cut on them, so I basically didn't have to do any work to put this bowl together. Still need to sand it, I still need to glue it up. I'll post it on Instagram the instant it's done, but I thought that was super cool. This is basically a zero waste project. Also, I wanted to mention that this is a 35-degree bowl on the Malcolm Tibbet chart and a 55-degree 12-sided stave bowl on the Matthias chart. If you want to replicate it, you can. Big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Big thank you to my Patreon supporters as always. You guys are the best, and I'll catch you on the next one.